At the start of round 6 of Norway chess, Sergei Karyakin led the field with 4 points. Carlsen and Nakamura had 3. So, could Magnus Carlsen win today to keep the pressure up on Karyakin? He faced Timur Radjabov. He had the white pieces, and we joined the game after 35 moves. And Carlsen is a little bit better. Why? Because of this knight here on c4 compared to this bishop on a7. You can see the bishop is blocked in by the pawn, and the knight stands very well blockading the pawn. But black also has something in this position. The rook is very active on a4, hitting the knight and the pawn on a2. Oh, that's the other thing that white has going for him. This outside pass pawn has, well, potential. It's not going anywhere at the moment. Radjabov brought his king to the middle. Okay, this is all sensible. And here, Radjabov was running slightly short of time. He had to get to move 40, had just a couple of minutes, and he played the natural move, king e6. If he'd had more time, he might have found this move, bishop b8. Now, let's see what happens. Okay, a3. That means the rook, to some extent, has some freedom and prevents the black rook going to b4. Bishop c7. And the bishop does a good job of controlling some important squares here, actually. So white's king comes forward, black's king comes across. Now white wants to drive away black's rook and push the a-pawn, but the problem is black has king b5. Now it's important that the bishop is placed on c7, preventing knight d6 driving away the king. And here Carlsen said that he really thought the position should be a draw. He couldn't see a way to make progress. The rook can't move away because the knight's on prise. And yeah, what can you do here? Now let's compare that with the game where Radjabov played, instead of bishop b8, king e6. So white brings the king across. Okay, the king comes up the board. It looks good on d5, but actually there are some problems. In this position, black is in a kind of Zugzwang. That means that whatever move he makes compromises his position. Not fatally, but here, for example, well, you don't really want to bring the king back because that will free the rook. You don't really want to move the rook back because that'll give the king freedom to come across the board. You can't move the bishop at all. If the bishop comes back, then knight b6 forks king and rook. And otherwise, well, you can push your pawns on the king side, and that's what Radjabov did. So Carlsen was content just to wait. So first of all, okay, he puts his pawn on a light square, that's good, away from the bishop, potentially. Radjabov pushed his pawns. Well, this isn't bad. Carlsen is just waiting with his rook, waiting for black's pieces to go back. And here Radjabov decided to retreat with his rook. Well, what happens if he plays, for example, f5 and continues pushing? Well, the pawns can be stopped. And probably, well, by advancing the f-pawn, you can see those pawns are weaker. I think Radjabov actually made a good decision here to retreat the rook, keeping a nice pawn chain. Right, the rook's gone back, and that gives white's rook freedom to activate onto the open file. So you can see that Carlsen has gained just a little something here. So the rook enters black's position, but it's absolutely not fatal. You can see it's still not possible to advance the a-pawn. So the bishop activates, and now the king comes across. Incidentally, a4 would be a good move. Unfortunately, the tactics don't work. If the pawn could get to a5, white will have achieved something, but after rook takes, knight b6, forking king and rook, but then king d6. Attacking white's rook saves black. So king c3, the king comes across to support the a-pawn. And black needs counterplay, otherwise, you know, king b3, a4, a5, and white is getting somewhere. So f5. King comes across, and g4. Now we'll see the point to this in a second. So white carries on with his plan, advancing the pawn. You can see that the pressure is starting to grow, and Carlsen has definitely made progress here. But Radjabov is defending very well. In this way, he manages to activate his rook. The rook is very passively placed in front of the pawn. But you'll see over these next few moves, although white's pawn advances, in fact, Radjabov defends very well here, putting his rook behind the passed pawn. If king a2, then rook b4 is annoying, threatening the knight, threatening rook a4, check. So the king has to come this way. The rook keeps hassling the king, so, by the way, rook takes knight is not possible there because of check and a7. But the rook keeps hassling the king, so the king is driven to a worse square, and only then the rook comes across. So this is important. The rook is activated, preventing the pawn advancing, but also from here it's able to hassle white's king. So this is good strategy. Now the knight's on prise. That has to, well, let's check. And the tactics just work for Carlsen. It's really interesting. I think to be a good endgame player, you need to be a really good tactician and a good calculator. And Carlsen had calculated that after this move, it's not possible to play rook takes a6 because of this check. And remarkably, wherever the king goes, there's some unfortunate fork. For example, if king c7, this wins. There are two pieces on prise here. Or, well, let me see. King e5 would lose to knight c4, followed by rook takes rook. Oh well, and so on. You can work out the rest. But it's incredible how everything works. And of course, Carlsen would have had to calculate this a long time before. So the king moves and a check. King b5. And the knight came to d5. Now Radjabov was again running short of time. He had to get to the move. Had to get to the time control at move 60. So he was under pressure. And here he played again seemingly a very natural move, bishop e5, which to some extent you can see controls that knight. But white has a good move here. Instead of bishop e5, it looks like rook a2 was a decent defense. So here, and the point of this is that by keeping the bishop on this diagonal, after rook b6, king here, now in the game knight e3 was possible. Here you can just take that off and the rook endgame should be a draw. But it's not possible to do that, and here you can actually hassle white's king and the game should be a draw. Obviously, you know, black, well, the players can repeat here. If white tries for more with king g2, actually white's king ends up in a real box here. f3 is threatened, and if white plays f3, well actually, you know, if white isn't careful, he could easily get the worst position here. The king is dreadful. You know, if the king moves to the side and c4, black is suddenly better. So yeah, basically after rook a2 check, black should be able to make a draw. But Radjabov played bishop e5, which looks fine. Let's just get that paint off the board. But then came rook b6, and this important check. And f4 is the best move. That can't be taken because of knight d5 check. Bishop d4 played, and now knight takes f5. So Carlsen has been able, before taking that pawn, he's been able to advance the f pawn. And as we'll see, that's rather useful. So white is now a pawn up. And I think the point is it's still very difficult for black to get going with this c pawn because the the rook and the knight stand so actively. And also the king is pretty good coming here, or sometimes even e4. Not to mention that pawn that is on prise. After c4, rook c6, excellent move. So making sure that this pawn isn't going anywhere, and because the knight is so well placed and the bishop is rather uncomfortably placed, there are loads of tactics here which mean that white can always control or sometimes even take that pawn. Radjabov tried rook h1, but now came knight d6. Good move, threatening not only to take the pawn, but also, embarrassingly for black, knight b5 check, forking king and bishop. And it looks like black is lost here. If rook takes pawn and the king comes up, you can take this pawn and, well, you take this and come back. Basically with 2 extra pawns, that's too much. The king will shepherd this pawn down the board. King d3 was played. Carlsen took the pawn. Check, king here. Now let's see what happens if rook g3 check. After the game, Carlsen mentioned this variation. I mean, I think there are several ways to win this position, but this is very clean. It's absolutely forced. Rook here, you give up the knight. Of course, black has to give up the bishop. And now this is a winning rook and pawn endgame. The point is that after, well, if you can, whoops, I beg your pardon. Let's just get this position back. This is a winning rook and pawn endgame. White threatens rook e7, cutting off black's king, and then the king and pawn just advance, and that's a win. And if king here, then king g5 is a winning move. Again, rook e7 is threatened, driving away the king. And if rook d5, king g4. And again, rook e7 is going to come on the next move, driving the king away, and the king and pawn just drive forward. A neat piece of calculation, and again, it shows you that the key to these endgames is just calculation. Secret of good technique. Rook h1 played, rook a4, and it's not really possible to stop this pawn. For example, bishop a7, you can just play knight b5 and drive the bishop away. So bishop f2 played, and after rook a3, Radjabov resigned. The king can't come to d4 because of a7, and if the king comes to e2, then you check, and, well, the king and bishop are very awkwardly placed. If king here, the neatest move is knight e4, threatening the bishop. If it moves this way, of course you can play a7, but don't forget that move. And if bishop g1, check. And now we'll play a7 and take the rook here. So, beautiful technique from Carlsen, and it's incredible how well he plays these really long games. He has such stamina. This wasn't quite the same as his game against Radjabov from London, but still a very long effort, and finally he wore down his opponent. So after 6 rounds, Carlsen has 4 points, just half a point behind Karyakin, who has 4.5. He drew today. Well, he drew against Anand. Anand played a beautiful game but didn't quite clinch it. So Karyakin 4.5, Carlsen 4, Nakamura only drew, so he has 3.5, and Aronian has 3.5.